I've been involved in a project looking into the role of education in peace building, and my background is education and conflict studies. And we've just finished an international collaborative project with two universities, one in Cambodia, one in Nepal, and another institution, INGO, Conflict Transformation INGO, in Nepal. And also my doctorate was education, conflict and peace building. So I'll be trying to draw upon both of my studies and try and share some of the insights which are related to international development. I suppose it relates somehow to recession, austerity and all those sorts of things, and still the international development funding remains untouched, ring-fenced, even in the times of difficulty. So education in conflict is a very new and emerging research area. There's a lot of work done in political science, in peace and conflict studies, but also clearly in educational research, a lot of pedagogical stuff. But linking education and conflict is a very new phenomenon. Mainly after 1980s or 1990s, when the civil wars emerged across the world, there was a need for protecting children in schools and homes. So it is related to the Geneva Convention. So education is a humanitarian response that even in difficult times, education needs to be protected. And also, international development sector sees education as a public sector that provides a sense of normalcy during conflict. Schooling can actually provide security in conflict-affected areas, and clearly, conflicting parties wouldn't deliberately attack schools as such. Of course, there are some exceptions. There have been some exceptions. And schools as zone of peace is a very popular campaign among international development agencies working in conflict-affected countries, including Nepal and a lot of other countries in Africa. But very recently, there's an attempt to theorize the interrelationship between education and conflict that has not been actually realized by the international development sector, that education has been seen as a social service for positive outcome for development, progress, changing society, make societies more civilized, and so forth. Some of the research that colleagues in Birmingham University did showed a lot around education can be a problem, and it can fuel conflict, it can generate conflict, and therefore just investing in education without critically examining the nature and the type of education in the developing world is not going to benefit. And there was also a report in 2000 by Bush and Saltarelli, funded by the UNICEF, which changed the whole dynamic of educational aid across the world. And they talked about these two phases of education, that education can fuel conflict, maybe by providing unequal access to education, by sort of practicing war curriculum, glorifying war, and also by excluding some of the social groups from the opportunity to get benefit from educational system and so forth, and therefore just more money in education doesn't help. So that was the beginning of the debate in being sort of looking education more critically in the international development sector. Again, colleagues from University of Ulster looked at education, conflict and international development. The report came out in 2003. It also contributed significantly to re-examine the policy of a Department for International Development in this country, as well as some other international development agencies of some of the Western countries. Now I'll take you to Nepal to talk a little bit about the People's War, which the armed conflict that began in 1996 and ended in 2006 with the signing of peace agreement. There's a lot written about it in relation to the causes of conflict in Nepal. Nepal is quite famous for, as we know, Gurkhas, mountains, all that sort of thing. Brave Nepalese, brave Gurkhas, but kind of poor Nepalese, and that kind of dichotomy. And clearly it is a very unequal society, and that's where the Communist Party of Nepal was able to capitalize on the grievances of some of the people, some of the social groups who had been historically marginalized and excluded from economic and political participation in the country. Clearly, when conflict takes place, schools come under attack because schools are political entities, and there were mass abduction of young children for political indoctrination, and there was mandatory donations imposed on teachers in rural areas, because in rural areas that were controlled by the insurgents, the teachers were the only people who could actually, generate cash from the government. So there was mandatory donations, and those who didn't comply with the Maoist demands were assaulted and even murdered. And also, teachers came, in the trap between the government forces as well as the Maoists, because the government would see teachers as spies, who were colluding, who were sort of collaborating with the rebels or the terrorists in those times. So teachers were always, or schools were always in the trap in the conflict, caught in the middle. But the other thing which is not very much explored is the role, the active role of teachers and students in the revolution. That the unfair, unjust social and political structures of society could only be transformed through a political communist revolution, and that was the belief of a vast majority of teachers and students across the country. And obviously there was a backdrop of communist movement which was covert for a long period of time, and which actually accumulated to become a Maoist insurgency in 1996. And finally in 2006 a peace agreement was signed between the government and the Maoists, and then this elections for the Constituent Assembly was held in 2008, and the Maoists became the largest party, amazingly surprising the whole international community, who were consistently fed by the neoliberal capitalist English-based media houses who were actually benefiting from the monarchy for a long period of time. That obviously the Maoists were popular among the people, and then therefore they became the largest party. Unfortunately, they didn't have the majority, two-thirds majority, to actually promulgate a new constitution, and there was a lot of political tension going on. Problematic role of India, being out there and always interfering in different things, and America, of course, being anti-communist as usual, not willing to see the Maoists in power, and ultimately last May the Constituent Assembly was dissolved, and the election council has been established under the leadership of incumbent Chief Justice, and the new election dates have been declared for the 19th of November. So that's where we are. The other country we looked at was Cambodia in relation to post-conflict society, what is actually happening in post-conflict society in the educational sector. That was the country when conflict finished very recently, and Cambodia conflict really finished in 1997, when most of the Khmer Rouge rebels actually decided to join the government, but actually it was the 1979, that's when the Khmer Rouge were toppled by the Vietnamese intervention, and that's where the Vietnamese occupation began. And a completely different country, but very, very similar in relation to educational development. But in Nepal, the educational development began in 1951. That's when the Rana oligarchy, which actually kept the whole country for outside educational access for a long period of time. And obviously French didn't want Cambodians to actually get education. So there were about 3 language schools for a long period of time that produced interpreters for the French colonizers. When Cambodia became independent in 1953, King Sihanouk invested a lot in educational development. There was massive educational expansion, a lot of universities and schools were established, and one of the major atoms of the educational process was to actually decolonize the Khmer culture, literature, and civic instruction. And there was a lot invested to revive Khmer script and Khmer way of life. Unfortunately, in 1970, General Lol Nol actually removed King Sihanouk and established the Khmer Republic. And a similar sort of thing happened in Nepal as well in 1969-70, that the king actually abolished all democratic political structures and actually to control over the education system. And the main agenda was to actually produce the citizenry which was loyal to the monarchy and the party-less political system, and create a particular type of national identity which was homogeneous but actually represented some of the political elites who dominated all spheres of life. And the similar things happened during Sihanouk's time, that the elite social groups of Cambodia actually benefited from the educational development. The rise of Khmer, as we know, that a huge number of people were murdered. 1.7 million out of 7 million people were eliminated during the period of 4 years. And the previous education system was completely eliminated. A vast number of school buildings were demolished, and there was a completely different chaotic situation in those times. And in 1997, as I mentioned earlier on, the Vietnamese intervention got rid of the Khmer, and the Paris Peace Accord in 1991 paved way for the peace process, and the elections in 1993 were held under the supervision and leadership actually of the United Nations Transitional Authority for Cambodia. Then in 1998, that marked the beginning of Hun Sen, who is the current prime minister, the era of a dictator, emergence of a military state. So we were working in 2 different societies which were very, very different in some ways, but also similar in so many different ways if we looked at the social construct and the political context of the country. I'm hoping to kind of develop these concepts by using a few theorists. For example, education as cultural reproduction, Pierre Bourdieu's theory, is quite useful to actually explain why the educational development, which was supposedly to provide access to all social groups for a period of time, didn't actually benefit some of the social groups who were marginalized, who were excluded for a long period of time. It's the theory of cultural capital, and also some of the theoretical concepts of Michael Apple and Antonio Gramsci also helps to kind of make sense of education and cultural hegemony, to explain the dominance of some of the social groups who are in power, continue to sort of control the educational processes and determine who would actually benefit from the educational development. And also at the same time, because the project was education for peace building, so we were exploring the concepts of peace building and peace building pedagogies, and that's where Henry Giroux becomes useful to actually look at the theory of resistance, how schools that are within the state hegemony, within the control of the state, can at the same time resist some of the influence and also serve for social and political change, and can also teachers can become more transformative to allow a political space for young people to be able to question some of the unfair and unjust practices that take place around the school and within the school at policy as well as practice level. And one of the papers I did very recently, drawing upon some of the ideas from Nepal, shows a lot in relation to some of the structural determinants of the education system can also emerge within the autonomy of a school, where the space of the classroom and of its surrounding communities can be exploited and expanded by educators in order to exercise counter-hegemonic pedagogies. And that actually related to the Maoist revolution, that the Maoist agenda for social and political transformation through structural reforms resonated with the idea of resistance to what the state was actually doing for a long period of time, and therefore teachers actually sympathized the Maoist revolution. Impact of conflict in a very different sort of situation here, clearly because of the geographical location of the countries. A lot of social structures have been deformed in Nepal, and the relations like ethnicity-based and gender relationships have been ruptured. And the people's grievances I mentioned earlier on have been sensitized. People are much more aware of the unjust structures that have been in place for a long period of time, but also there is a tension of national identity, because the single identity which has been legitimized by the state, which has been a project of the state for a long time, has been weakened because of the revolution, and therefore people are thinking like, is our ethnic identity superior to our national identity? Are we going into federalism, and therefore our federal identity is going to be the prime focus? Those sorts of things are tensions. Cambodia, massive economic growth, neoliberal market economy. As a result, there's a massive gap, increasing gap between the poor and rich people. And I think this is what has been our key observation, that education is part of the whole political economy process in both countries, that there's a massive corruption, and there are neoliberal policy demands such as decentralization of education, cuts in funding, and making much more privatization of basic education systems. And because these societies are very poor, there's massive corruption at local level. And centralization, particularly in Nepal, decentralization, particularly in Nepal, becomes more centralized decentralization, because there's massive World Bank funding coming in, which puts a condition as, if you decentralize your schools, if you hand over your schools to the communities, then we will give you money. And therefore it's like the people who are in power instigating decentralization, and people not really buying into that idea, and ultimately education becoming poor people's responsibility, a bit like free school debate in this country. I suppose we could relate. All these global policy frameworks travel even in the developing world. So it's because these social structures are so rigid, and these pro-poor policies don't necessarily work, and also there's a lack between, there's a gap between those who work in the international development sector and the ground reality, who these people are parachuted for a period of two or 3 years, and would like to show results in a short period of time. And these are very culturally complex societies that these things don't seem to work. And obviously there's a capture elite capture at local level, that the same people who have monopolized power for a long period of time seem to be benefiting from the educational reforms, which defeats the purpose. This is something which is quite interesting, that there's a massive politicization of education at different level. If you look at Cambodia, it's the political capture of the Hun Sen's political party, Cambodian People's Party, that all teachers, head teachers are politically appointed, and if you don't belong to the main political party, which is in the government, then either you lose your job very quickly, or you are in trouble, you are marginalized. So it's all captured by the political party that is in power, and that party is in power for the last 20 years. And in Nepal, teachers are much more politically aware and active and participate in political movements. But in Cambodia, there's massive corruption in education, because teachers shouldn't legally be charging fees to students, but they actually do, and the government overlooks that. By overlooking corruption, government actually receives support from these teachers, and these teachers always live in the fear because they are doing something illegal. So it's a very complex nexus between the political force and teachers working in schools that actually legitimizes the whole process of corruption. Now I'm going to finish here. That some of the things that I'm hoping, that I'm currently writing a book proposal to actually develop ideas through. That one of the things is that the international development sector generally focuses on the technical aspects of educational reforms. Train more teachers, give more funding, educational resources, like education for all, that every child should go to school, that kind of thing, without actually investing in structural reforms, like girls don't go to school because of gender hierarchies, because of other social problems that are there in society. So just by kind of campaigning, investing so much on go to school sort of campaigns doesn't actually bring girls to school. Even if they come to school, then they drop out fairly quickly, and therefore some of these broader problems that these societies have, unless these are restructured, the technical solutions don't seem to work. The other thing is that the politicization is becoming quite a popular thing in international development sector. If you look at Nepal's politicization, which is more political involvement, debating about social injustice, and therefore extending support to different political parties, whereas in Cambodia, politicization is much more about corruption and control of the leading political party, in the education system. So that's where I think is kind of new area that needs more work. And I am quite hopeful about, particularly in Nepal, where we are trying to develop this peace-building education course for teacher education programs, that I see that the teachers who are politically aware are able to analyze social, political, economic and cultural issues that surround schools and that also impact upon people's lives in those communities, are better placed to actually get engaged with the critical pedagogy, and therefore making young people aware and enable them with the skills that are necessary to actually build sustainable peace in their societies. Whereas that wouldn't necessarily happen in Cambodian context, because that would be seen as a threat, because making the populations aware of social, economic injustice and political capture in that society is a threat to the dictatorship, and therefore that's a kind of challenging thing. And when colleagues talk about these issues in a workshop and they look around, they're very careful about what they say. And we are a little bit privileged being foreigners. The worst scenario would be that we would be deported, and they would suffer much more than that. That's why it's very difficult to actually even talk about these sorts of issues. So that's where we are, and we're presenting 4 different papers at the YUCFIT conference at Oxford University in September. So our colleagues are coming over from Cambodia and Nepal, so we're excited about that. Thank you.
it's really fascinating. I didn't know quite where you were going to take the argument, but the politicisation of education is interesting, isn't it? Because education and educators are sort of very easily identifiable, they're very visible as a community, should we call it, within any society. And they're often associated with the potential to be a threat, or they're associated directly with a political driver.
Absolutely.
And we've seen intelligentsia purges. Khmer Rouge is one, Stalin's another going back. It happens time and time again. So there are issues around that. It's a very easy target in many ways. But somewhere like Cambodia, following Pol Pot, I mean, where did the teachers emerge from? Because they were effectively purged completely. So how did the teacher training element emerge in Cambodia following that, let alone education?
After 1991, when the United Nations took over, there was massive international aid, massive, billions and billions of dollars poured into Cambodian reconstruction project. And basically they encouraged everyone who was able to read and write to come forward and to be part of the teacher training program, which was 1 month long, and then go out to schools and start schools and bring kids to the school. And that's how it started. And just before 1991, when the Khmer Rouge were toppled in 1979, Vietnamese took over, and it was very, very difficult for young people to actually go on to higher education, because they needed people in the army to fight the Khmer Rouge who were still knocking around in the forests. So one of our colleagues who is a partner in this project, he escaped to go to university, and he bribed some people to remain in the university so that he wouldn't be picked up and sent to forest to fight. So really difficult times. But once Hun Sen came into power in 1998, completely eliminating his political opponent, there's great amount of stability, which people really, really enjoy, because there's a fear in people's mind that keeps Cambodia peaceful now, because and the state has actually used this apparatus as a powerful tool to keep people silent and not to question the whole corruption that goes in the country. And still, the teachers are not up to the level that they should be. Clearly, that is the common problem in the developing world. But I think you can clearly see how a whole generation is excluded from the speed of educational development, then how that society needs a very, very long period of time to be able to catch up with the normal process of education. There you can see that clearly. Thank you. Thank you very much.